adversely affected, and that's not the same for a person who is 5 miles away from there. And if the person 5 miles away from there happens to be the owner of the CAFO, it's the best of all possible worlds. We used to have, or it suggested, a tongue-in-cheek rule for Nebraska, actually, at one point in time, called the Sands setback. A guy by the name of Sands was in charge of building hog CAFOs all over Nebraska. And the interesting thing was that he never built them by his house. He built them by everybody else's house. And we proposed a rule for the state of Nebraska that no person should have to live any closer to one of Sands hog farms than he lived. At which point he couldn't have put one in the state, okay? The deal is, what you're doing is that you're shifting the costs to your neighbors. And when that happens in a small rural community, the effect is absolutely devastating because the community fights with itself. The people you're fighting with are the same people you run into at church or in the grocery store or, heaven forbid, in the bar when you're both liquored up. And the problem just magnifies itself. In the case of our intervention in Burley, Idaho, where this hog farm was going to be, after it was over and after they voted it down, the young wife who had been kind of the stalwart of this effect and stuff, young woman, she'd aged 15 years over the last year. And it was because of the adverse result of what happened in the community. What this comes down to is an interesting realization, and I want to take a little bit of a lateral arabesque here. I have been concerned for the last 2 or 3 years that the industry isn't as angry at us as they ought to be. Quite frankly, the industry doesn't give a hoot what we're doing. And the reason that they don't give a hoot what we're doing is that they have, in their own minds, already succeeded. It doesn't make any difference whether we force them to remove roxarsen from chicken feed or not, when they control all the processing, and they control all the marketing, and they control what we're going to be eating from there on out. I had the either fortune or misfortune of being on a 5-day wilderness raft trip last summer with a guy from Philadelphia, actually, who was executive in a supermarket chain. And he and I had a number of conversations, none of which resulted in me drowning him, but I came close a couple times. And his deal was, well, what are you talking about? This is ridiculous. You can't possibly do this. And what's more, you can't do this because you don't have the ability to market this stuff. You don't have the ability to process this stuff. You don't have the ability to do this. What we're left with is a situation where rural communities across the nation have been devastated by this shift of pollution to rural areas. They retain the ability in those communities to produce the goods that we need in the future to a certain extent. Somebody asked about a sustainable model for cattle production. The fact is there is no sustainable model for cattle production given the amount of meat that we eat in the United States, period. Okay? Part of what goes to create sustainability is to eat less meat. You cannot produce as many cattle as you produce in the United States sustainably. Just flat can't do it, okay? You can create a sustainable model for smaller operations for folks who don't eat as much meat, but nobody's been able to or willing to take on that dual part of this question. And what we're left with here is a whole group of people who can either be taught or who still understand how we can do things in a basically sustainable way. But even though that skill has survived, we've lost the skill to process, and we've lost, or not the skill, but the ability to process, and we've lost the ability to market. And that's what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk. Now, when you talk about rural communities and why they've been devastated, what you have to realize is that a rural community is a little economic machine. And it works on retaining money and jobs in the community and circulating it in the community. And if you break that, if you take the jobs out of the community, or worse, if you take the money out of the community, the little economic machine comes apart. So, the only way that you keep a rural community viable is that you have a method set up to take what is produced in the community and then add value to it. Not doing that converts you immediately to a third world country. What happens in third world countries? First and second world countries come in, they extract the resources, and they leave, okay? And that's precisely what's happening in a number of rural communities. People come in, they extract the resource, which is something that's raised there, they leave behind their pollution, and they skedaddle out of there. And you don't get the benefit of adding the cut and wrap. You don't get the benefit of adding the kill facility. You don't get any of this benefit. And as a result, the community has no economic benefit. Both corporate agriculture, and this has been shown over and over in economic research, and the gas industry act that way. So it doesn't make any difference to me if the gas industry comes into your community and pays 4 people $200,000 a pop so that they can drill wells to poison the rest of the folks in the community. The fact of the matter is that when the gas is extracted, there's going to be little or no value added in the community, and it's going someplace else, and somebody else in the corporation is going to be making the money. And the same thing happens in the confined animal feeding operations. Same identical thing. And like I say, that has been so clearly determined that even Big Ag doesn't argue that one anymore. Second, you need to realize that corporate agriculture has survived in the United States, not because it's viable, because their economic model has totally failed. Every aspect, based on cheap food, cheap labor, cheap power, all has turned out to be wrong. So why have they survived? Because they are so heavily subsidized by the Department of Agriculture. How much? Well, in the case of, let's take the dairy industry, okay? Last year, every dairy, Idaho, strangely enough, now has more dairies than almost all other states. Not all of them, but pretty darn close. And we're kind of out of the potato business, and we're producing crap and milk. Not necessarily in that order. The dairy industry, last year, every owner or every operation was either bankrupt or technically bankrupt. They were losing $50 a cow a day, okay? And they went through all their reserves. How many of them actually went out of business? A surprisingly small number, because USDA stepped in and bought animals and did other things to keep them afloat, okay? So how much is not something we can answer directly, but we can say it's enough to make up whatever difference should have flushed them out of the market. And if you're a free market economist, what you would say is that's wrong. They should be allowed to fail if they're not operating properly. Similarly, gas fracking, if the real costs were accounted for, would not be a viable energy source, period. No way. But in both cases, what you get is tax and subsidy policies that are keeping these things alive. And that's not the economist's fault. Taxes and subsidies are basically a political science result which comes from deciding to focus interest and keep industries alive in spite of the fact that it's not an economically feasible operation. So, where do we go from that? Well, in the first place, the general response by a lot of people is, we've got to stop this stuff. And we've got to stop it through more regulation. And this is where I'm going to take a turn away from something that you said. And what I'd like you to consider is this. We have been in a period of working on regulations for confined animal feeding operations for the last 20 years. What has happened during that time? What do the data show? The data show that the number of small farmers has dwindled dramatically during that time. Did you ever draw the connection between increasing regulation and increasing loss of small farmers? Do you know why that's the case? It's the case because regulations that you pass are a fixed cost to the industry, which is to say that if you go to somebody and say, we need you to build a specific type of liner, or excuse me, to install a specific type of liner for a lagoon, okay? That is going to be a purchase like a tractor, or it's going to be a purchase like a building, or something like that. How much is that going to cost you? Well, the people who raise animals, the issue is, how much is that going to add to the cost of each animal? And so the more animals you have, the less the cost on each animal. And perversely, regulations have turned out to increase the cost to small producers more than large producers. Now, this is not to say that we shouldn't have regulation, but it is to say that we cannot regulate ourselves out of this mess. Yeah?
I'm just confused by your point, because CAFOs only make up less than 0.5% of the farms in Pennsylvania. How can you associate it at all with regulation, as opposed to having the large industries keeping the prices artificially low? Now that has an effect on small farmers. Yeah,
but understand that you cannot take the number of CAFOs compared to the number of other operations. What you got to take is the production from the CAFOs compared to the other operations. Okay, it's the amount of market that they control, and that amount of market across the United States has essentially removed the other folks as a significant factor. I think Jillian had a slide up there which showed that the number of people that are producing small numbers of animals are accounting for, what, 1-2% of what the production is, and the rest of it's all going to CAFOs. So the deal is that it isn't the actual number of facilities. As a matter of fact, what we're talking about here is something that will cause the facilities to continue to combine, and so you have fewer and fewer facilities with more and more animals. That's really the issue.
But if those regulations, I just can't understand. If the regulations do not apply to the small farms. Small farms don't have to put in lagoons. They don't have to add things. So how, explain please.
Yeah, but the small farms do have to comply with all the regulations that have to do with processing and that entire area. And that has put the entire processing business out of business in rural areas. That's where it's important. And once again, it's the same operation. If you can set up a plant and run 300,000 animals a day through the plant, then by golly, it doesn't cost you very much to have some sort of regulation on processing in place. If on the other hand, you're killing 4 cows a month,